And we also each construct what I call a narrative self. That is, we have a self that wakes up in the morning, goes to bed at night, has a history and a biography and hopes and fears. And that is something that, while all of these things have certain underlying intimations in other organisms and other animals in particular, we just do this as the major thing that we do in our lives. So each religious tradition also has a story, what we call a core narrative, a mythos, a large story. For these, there are interpretations that are embedded in the mythos and elaborated by religious leaders. Secondly, there are spiritual responses to this mythos. These are elicited chiefly via art and ceremony that are administered by religious leaders. And thirdly, there are moral and ethical edicts that are built into the fabric of the mythos and elaborated by religious leaders. So these interpretations, this might be something, if you're in the Protestant tradition, you go to church, there's a passage read from the Bible, and then the pastor during the sermon will give you his interpretation or the tradition's interpretation of that story, of that account. You then sing hymns and you look at the stained glass, and these are the spiritual responses. And then moral, ethical edicts are built into the fabric of this. This is what Jesus or whoever said to do, and the religious leaders elaborate on that. I realized I forgot to turn off my email, so you're just going to hear a ping every once in a while. And you know what that is. Okay. So scientific inquiry has provisioned us with a mind-blowing new core narrative. The history of nature, the epic of evolution, the epic of creation, the universe story, the news story. And my favorite from Loyal Rue is that it's everybody's story. So it was not created by a particular culture in a particular circumstance. It has come to us over centuries from scientific inquiry to generate now a very coherent understanding of who we are and how we got here, which is ever deepening, ever being improved on, but it has now a coherence that makes it very compelling. So here's an outline of this story, and I gather from the topic of your course that you've probably been through it, but first we have the evolution of the observable universe 13.8 billion years ago, starting with the singularity, the Big Bang, the galaxies with stars, nucleosynthesis in the dying stars, supernovas spreading these new kinds of atoms out into the universe. Then, 4.5 billion years ago, our sun and the planets, including the planet Earth, come into being. 3.7 billion years or so, the evolution of life on Earth, first the origin and then the evolution of this life. And particularly interesting to us as animals is the evolution of minds, which started 550 million years ago with the first animals with neurons. We then have social minds, hominid minds, and human minds. So just to get this into some perspective, so is the full screen showing for you? I've got this little blurb here. Oh, you can't tell me. Is it okay? Yes, yes?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Oh, wait, sorry. We can see the first part, so the story of the observable universe.
Yeah, but can you see the part on the other side, the green part?
We can't see the curriculum offerings or the...
No? So how do I get rid of this?
Maybe not do it as a slideshow? Or
yeah.
Share screen and just share PowerPoint now since it's open.
So there's this little block that has a picture of me, it has a picture of you, and it has then Sven Jatel. Is there any way I can get rid of all of that?
Could you maybe not put it in presenter's view? Just show us the slide, and
Oh,
we'll be able to show up to see everything.
okay. Do you care about seeing all the rest of my stuff? Okay. Well, this way I can also get rid of my email. That's good.
Yes, you can.
All right. And there's no way to get rid of this?
Should we do fit to window?
Try it. Try fit window.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
So now she can go full screen again.
Okay, sorry, it was a technical problem on our end. We fixed it. So if you go back to presenter's view, it should work now. I apologize.
No problem. Presenter's view. So that should be down below.
Just within PowerPoint.
Yeah. Okay. Go to this.
Okay,
No.
Perfect.
Yay.
Okay. So that thing is still on my screen, but if you're not seeing it, I can probably figure out what's on the right-hand side. All right. So if you were going to college 13.8 billion years ago, then for a long time, if you went to college, there would only be 2 courses offered, physics and math. Okay. 4.5 billion years ago, you could also take 2 more courses, chemistry and geology. 3.7 billion years ago, you could now take biology and ecology courses. And then 550 million years ago, and please note the big gap between 3.7 and 550 million, you could start taking animal minds, you could start taking psychology courses, social minds, you could take sociology courses, and finally human minds that showed up about 160,000 years ago, you would be taking humanities courses. So here's some of the Clarion images. This is a Hubble shot a long time ago out into the universe. All of these are galaxies, hundreds of billions of them each with hundreds of billions of stars. Here is a fantastic shot from Mars of our planet. And here is our planet. And here's the geology of our planet. So 150 million years ago, our planet looked like this, where you can sort of recognize most of the continents. But 450 million years ago, remember animals showed up 550 million years ago, the plates are just all over the place, and we don't even know what they were doing prior to this time. But they were moving around. So in terms of life, we first have the non-life to life transition, but this early life I call proto-life because it was just something that was replicating and reproducing itself. And this then started undergoing evolution into forms that went extinct. But we know that one form carried through time to about 3 billion years ago, and we call this critter the last universal common ancestor because it is now clear that such an organism gave rise to the 3 major radiations on the planet, the bacteria, the eukaryotes, and the archaea. So here are the 3, archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotes. And here is where that last universal common ancestor would be positioned. And we know that this is the case because organisms in all of these 3 radiations all use the same basic idea for how to be a cell. They all use DNA, RNA, ribosomes, proteins. You can put genes from archaea into eukaryotes and they work fine, and vice versa. So if we focus on the eukaryotes, that's where we are. And you guys may be sufficiently hip that you can figure out where we lie on this tree. But there we are. So even in our group, many, many, many different kinds of organisms. And the way you do this kind of tree is, again, looking for common ancestor. So here is the common ancestor between us and a group called the choanoflagellates, which look like this. They're single-celled organisms that live in the ocean and swim around and catch prey. So the interconnection between everything is there, and I'll be spreading a lot more time thinking about that. Here's a wonderful diagram that came out a few years ago. And so here in the top left, we see bacteria and archaea are just lines here, so this thing would be unreadable if they were included. But here are all the eukaryotes, and then they enlarge them. So this is the animal sector here. Here's the animal sector enlarged where it says you are here. Here, a little more enlarged. And then finally, where you can read it, Homo sapiens in here next to the mouse. So evolution has been spectacular in generating diversity and inhabiting all the places on the planet. So here's our own tree. So we can say that this is the common ancestor to the orangs and everybody else. This is the common ancestor to the gorilla and everyone else. This is the common ancestor to the human and to the two kinds of chimps that actually diverged after we started to go along this path, Australopithecus, all of the other critters leading to the modern human. And this tree has elicited from Terry Deacon the following observation. Biologically, we are just another ape. Mentally, we are a whole new phylum of organism. And what he means by that, this human uniqueness that I lifted up at the start, is that we have the symbolic language that generates a narrative self, what we sometimes call our self-consciousness, and language-based cultures that we inhabit and learn from. So going back to the humanities, this unique thing that we humans do, art, music, human history, philosophy, religions, these are all created and transmitted via these language-based human cultures, which means that they're remembered and added to. And critically, culture and the humanities are part of nature, not outside it. So many people think that this is something else, and to my mind, that's not the case. Okay, so a naturalist, I would say, takes everybody's story that we've just considered, takes that story seriously, takes nature seriously, and adopts the story as a core narrative. What I'm going to be spending the rest of my time talking about is that someone called a religious naturalist, which is what I call myself. And a religious naturalist also explores the religious potential of everybody's story. So, what do we mean by religious potential? Let's go back to the three key axes of religious exploration. There's interpretations of the story, there's spiritual responses to the story, and there are moral, ethical orientations that are gleaned from the story. None of these is front-loaded into everybody's story. Nature just is. Nature has done her thing. And so that means that we humans who are seeking to its potential as a religious narrative, we get to explore them de novo. There's no right answer, which I love. But here are some of the things that we get to consider on the interpretive axis. This entails asking the big questions along philosophical and existential axes. Questions like, how does everybody's story inform my experience of being a self? What does it tell me about free will, death, love, the search for the meaning of life? Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? The spiritual axis entails exploring inward religious responses to everybody's story, including awe and wonder, gratitude, assent, commitment, humility, reverence, joy, and the astonishment of being alive at all. And lastly, the moral. Here we should pause and say, okay, where do human moral understandings come from? So a person with theistic beliefs would say that these understandings come from God, by whatever name. A philosopher would say that they come from human reason, that we reason these moral understandings out. The religious naturalist would state, or I do anyway, that it is natural for humans to be pro-social. Going back to our tree, here are our ape relatives, and Frans de Waal, who studies these animals and ourselves, speaks of the antiquity of our moral sense. What does he mean by that? Well, when we look at our fellow apes, what we see is, first of all, that they form very elaborate troops that govern themselves via hierarchy and via reciprocity. And this is very much the way we organize our own political organizations. One also finds, not only in the apes, but of course all the way down through the mammals, maternal nurture that looks very familiar. In addition, there's group nurture. So this baby bonobo is playing airplane, not with his mother, but with his aunt. So all of the relatives in the troop, or people in the troop, they're people to me, apes in the troop, they take care of the babies and love them. There's a huge importance in non-human ape cultures for friendship. They groom each other, they defend each other against aggressors, and this is also, of course, looks very familiar. So on the right is Lucy in a zoo. She has a boo-boo on her leg, and her brother is looking at it, and to my eye and to many others, it looks like he's concerned about her injury. Empathy. So familiarity with non-human primates is very much, gives us the sense of our moral sense having deep roots. So our ape sensibilities, although we have them, have not been left, since we know that we have them, they've not been left in the evolutionary dustbin, but I would say that they're not experienced the way apes experience them either. They're experienced as human minds experience things. Namely, as we've said, symbolically and in narrative form. Particularly important to the religious naturalist orientation is what we call eco-morality, seeking right relations not just between humans, but between the earth and its creatures, based on our interrelatedness, our interdependence, and our responsibilities. So eco-morality entails an intimate knowledge of the history and the workings of the natural world. Timothy Ferris has a great quote where he says he knows environmentalists who would do just about anything for the environment except take a science course. Eco-morality also entails an understanding that humans and their cultures are a part of the natural world, and accepting and then rejoicing in one's critterhood, one's connectedness with all other beings and all those countless beings who died for us during the evolutionary saga. So this image lifts up our interrelatedness. The fungi here are very close relatives of us on the eukaryotic tree. The moss and the lichens and the tree itself are in the plant radiation, and then the photographer is in the human radiation. All interrelated, And all of these organisms on this tree and in the soil are interdependent on one another, and we are dependent on all of this for our own sustenance. So the responsibility comes, of course, from the fact that this whole system, this whole planetary system, is under siege by the humans, and the religious naturalist would say we have a responsibility to that whole living system to make sure that it is sustained. So, a vanilla naturalist, just any scientist probably, takes nature seriously. A religious naturalist takes nature seriously to the point where they might use a capital N. And importantly, a religious naturalist also takes nature to heart. So what do we mean by taking nature to heart? Well, Loyal Rue in a recent book wrote the following, which I think is wonderful. If I were to say that I have taken the Quran to heart, you might infer that the teachings of the Quran now shape how I feel, think, and act. I now take Allah's will as my own, and I have a newly clarified sense of who I am, where I came from, and where I am going. Taking the Quran to heart alters the fabric of my self-understanding. It shifts my teleological center of gravity, and I operate differently in my efforts to live in harmony with that reality. Taking nature to heart means that your heart can be broken. This is Shanghai, a few months ago. The glacier in 1928, in the same scene in 2004. After the BP oil spill. And children in India who work the dumps to scavenge materials. Taking something to heart means experiencing moral outrage when that which is revered is desecrated, and then acting on that outrage. So being a religious naturalist is an active stance. So, okay, what about the supernatural? So I don't know you guys in the room. Some of you may be persons of various faith. It turns out that most religious naturalists are so steeped in nature that they experience no need for belief in supernatural causation. Some, however, prefer to believe that there is something else besides nature. So I'm going to close this presentation by considering briefly both of these perspectives. So first, religious naturalism without God language. We find our sources of meaning within the natural world, where humans are understood to be emergent from and hence a part of nature. Our religious quest is informed and guided by the deepening and evolving understandings fostered by scientific inquiry, and by the mindful understandings inherent in our human traditions, including art, literature, philosophy, and the religions of the world. We've got lots to work with. The natural world and its emergent manifestations in human creativity and community are the focus of our immersion, wonder, and reverence. And our common naturalistic orientation generates our shared sense of place, gratitude, and joy. We acknowledge as well a sense of shared values and concerns pertaining to peace, justice, dignity, responsible freedom, the richness of ethnic, culture, and ecological diversity, and planetary sustainability. We are committed to furthering the realization of these values and are convinced that the naturalistic perspective has much to offer in this process. And here's one that came through to me last week, and I had to include it. Someone said, when I discovered religious naturalism, I resonated immediately with its desire to hold mystery and science as complementary features of a thoughtful life. Where mystery here means that there are questions that we don't have answers to, perhaps never will. The big one being, why is there anything at all rather than nothing? And scientific inquiry respects mystery. Okay, so here's Phil Hefner, a wonderful friend from the Lutheran Theological Seminary, who speaks of being a religious naturalist using God language. I believe that evolution is the way that God has created the world. God has woven the creation on the web of emergence, adaptation, and natural selection. We are very far from understanding the significance of this aspect of God's creation, and also far from integrating this truth into our systems of belief. Some think that attention to the sciences is to be feared, that it reduces religion and faith to molecules, genes, and neurons. On the contrary, it throws light on how God has created our world and what the actual purpose of faith and religion might be in the divine purview. Scientific perspectives can free faith, morality, and spirituality to be richer, more constructive, and from a believer's perspective, more faithful. We have much more to fear if we ignore or reject them. All religions face the challenge and the excitement of engaging new ideas of nature and allowing their worldviews to be changed and enriched by this engagement. In this sense, all of us, regardless of our starting points, are called to take nature into our religious frameworks. We are all called upon to be religious naturalists. Any viewpoint that does not attempt to take the measure of nature as we presently know it is in danger of becoming debilitating rather than enriching in all three of the religious spheres, the interpretive, the spiritual, and the moral. For those of us who begin with God, the challenge is to recognize that our scientific understandings are revelation. Revelation of what God has done, what God is doing now, and what God intends. So one more summary. A religious naturalist is anchored in and dwells within her understandings of the natural world. He finds religious orientation within that meta-narrative and develops mindful religious responses to it, interpretive, spiritual, and moral. Importantly, these responses often deeply overlap those espoused by existing traditions. The adoption of a meta-narrative does not necessarily alter the human impulse toward common spiritual and moral sensibilities. Rather, it influences how we get there. So, the religious traditions throughout human history have always been based in communities, in tribal groups, in parishes, in world religions of all sorts, but there's always community, usually face-to-face, usually in buildings or around campfires, where humans are with one another. So those of us who are suggesting this relatively novel, new orientation, what do? How do we find each other? And so my last two slides will lift up. I'm not promoting, just letting you know that in 2014, this lovely man on the left, Michael Cavanaugh from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, set up a 501c3, that's in America, a nonprofit corporation that we call the Religious Naturalist Association. And in those 3 years, without any advertising or anything, we have more than 450 members from 48 states and 25 countries, including a good number of Canadians. I just checked, and you're here. And membership in this is free if you felt like going online and looking at it. Here's what the website starts out with. It says the Religious Naturalist Association, or RNA, pun intended, was formed to bring together people from around the world who see themselves as religious naturalists and to introduce this concept to those who are not familiar with it. This website provides a point of entry and resource for exploring the religious naturalist orientation and for sharing ideas with other members. So the website has lots of links to resources like books, videos, members' projects, meetings of interest, yada, yada, the usual. We have a wonderful board of advisors, including many of these people on this list are people who have self-declared and have written books on being religious naturalists. And some of the others are clergy and some are scientists. So we have a Facebook group, Google groups, monthly newsletters. We've had a few meetups, and we revel in the knowledge of each other's existence. But the whole question of whether something like a religious community can exist only online, whether it has to be face-to-face, if so, how that can happen, is something that we're actively talking about all the time, and love to hear any ideas you guys might have. So let me end with this wonderful poem by Mary Oliver called Wild Geese, which to me is a beautiful lift up of what I've been talking about. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the river. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. Okay, hi. Do I have sound? Thank you.
All right, so we start question session, maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes questions, depending on how many there are. Anyone? No, go ahead.
First of all, thanks so much for joining us through Zoom and for your presentation. I really resonate. I noticed Michael Dowd and Connie Barlow on your list of board members. I read Thank God for Evolution 8 or 9 years ago, so it's been sort of a part of my ethos. I guess one point that I thought was interesting, I love your phrase, rejoicing in our critterhood.
Yeah.
And that related to, so you said, like, so we have this ape morality, and then also, and I'm seeing it as sort of augmented or supplementary, this like symbolic, that we still have the ape experience, the sort of critter embodied, like soft animal of our body, rather than like substitutive, rather than like instead of like we've replaced it with something else, you know?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, we just, since we do this thing of using language and making up words for things. We have a word called maternal, or a phrase called maternal love, right? And they don't have that, but they sure have it, right?
Right.
So, but then when we start doing things like maternal love, then we, get symbols for that. And we have the Virgin Mary and all the rest of it that tries to lift it up and make it something that speaks to the way our minds think, which is the symbolic narrative version of it. So I see that understanding as very exciting. It means that we are absolutely, we are apes, and we do have ape feelings, and they are very social and very wonderful in so many ways. And then we just do different things with it. And the error, I guess I would say, that has beset humans for so many centuries is putting ourselves apart from the other animals and thinking that these moral ideas that we have are somehow just ours, and therefore we are going to heaven and hell and don't even care about what happens to the rest of creation. And I think that's hopefully something that we're trying to let people get away from.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hello.
Hi. What's your name?
Carly.
Hi, Carl.
Hi. I just want to say thank you so much. All of this stuff is really new to me. I'm coming from a background, and I'm feeling like the more I'm immersed in these readings, the more I don't know. It's kind of relating to that Steven Weinberg concept in your paper about the more I know, the more it seems pointless. But I don't think it seems pointless. I just think the more I know, the less I know. Yeah, and I just wanted to know how or when did you kind of adopt this religious naturalist perspective, and do you have like a vast knowledge of all the other religions? Like how did this religious naturalist perspective develop, I guess?
Well, thank you. So it turns out that in 1998, I had a book published. It's called The Sacred Depths of Nature. And so that was almost 20 years ago. And no, maybe it came out in 2000. No, whenever it came out, 2000, I guess. So in it, I give a response to what you said. I don't expect you to read it, so I'll briefly say that my father was a historian of religion, actually, at Yale University. And so the idea that religions were interesting was sort of part of my zeitgeist. But I didn't go to church as a kid, didn't pay attention to any of it. And then started wondering, why was I not religious, and was that true, and what does being religious mean anyway? So I was kind of thinking along those lines, and found myself at a conference put on by a group with a horrible name. It's called the Institute on Religion in the Age of Science. But they have annual meetings and lots of very few scientists there. So I was greatly welcomed when I started coming to the meetings. Just, gosh, you got a scientist. But most of them were theologians, philosophers, and ministers. And so through them, and particularly this guy, Loyal Rue, whom I've quoted several times, who's a philosopher of religion, really helped me understand the traditions. To the extent that I do, let me quickly say, I don't understand them nearly as well as probably some of you from your own tradition, but I know quite a bit about Christianity anyway, because it sort of steeps the American culture. And so from that, I just started talking to people and trying to think this stuff up. And I wrote a book, Loyal wrote a book about the same time. Other people, Michael Dowd has been mentioned, have written them since. And we've all kind of come to the conclusion that this is a really fruitful and rewarding and sustaining orientation. And we're also very much excited by the fact that there is no such thing as a religious naturalism, right? That you're supposed to believe in, that each person in the end is taking in this story. The story you don't get to mess with. The story is out there. Scientists can deepen it for us. But that what we do is come up with our spiritual and interpretive and moral understandings of this story via our own search and via reading other people's searches and talking on Google groups and all of that. And it just is so cool to realize that there isn't a dogma that has to do with one's faith tradition, but one that really speaks to oneself.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Yes, thank you so much.
And so you who are coming, I gather, from another tradition, how were you raised?
I don't have any. I was the only child in my family that wasn't baptized. Yeah, and I never went to church. I don't have any religious background whatsoever.
So you're coming from where I was, sort of. I said, yeah, I'm not religious.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then I thought, well, wait a minute, is that really true? And I started wondering about it. And there are many people who claim that all humans have this religious impulse. Some people have even said we're not Homo sapiens, we're Homo religiosus, that we need these central orientations, these core stories to get through our lives in some sort of meaningful way. And that makes sense to me.
Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome. Try this one out.
Hi, this is something related to what John was saying before about us having these moralities coming from apes. We share them because we are apes, but we experience it differently, symbolically, in narrative forms, and cultures. I feel that to many extents, those things can be seen in apes and in other organisms, maybe in smaller levels than in us, but things like cultures can be seen in groups of chimps. So I was wondering whether that would be something you agree with, that it's more a difference of a degree rather than kind, even in those aspects.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can slice and dice words like culture for the next week, okay? So is the fact that fish form schools and birds form flocks, is that a cultural activity or is that a social activity? And what do we mean by culture, and yada, yada, yada. So a lot of these words I've had to come up with my own definitions of them just so that I can think about them and talk about them. And so I use the term culture to mean something that is articulated in language such that the story about that particular idea, understanding, meaning, whatever, is transmissible from one generation to the next. And that makes it different from something like a termite stick that an ape might use, where that is, as near as the people observing it can tell, not so much that the ape is showing another ape how to do it. It's that the ape is sticking the stick into the termite nest and eating the termites. Mm-hmm. The other ape notices it and imitates it. Yeah. And that's different from teaching, different from transmission in the way that we do it. So no, I don't, as I hope you gathered by now, I don't see any bright dividing line between humans and other apes, or in many ways other organisms. But I do think that when we use the word culture, you might as well use it the way it was originally intended, which was to talk about what humans did. Okay. Does that help?
Yes, yes, it's helpful.
Okay.
I have one question.
Hi, what's your name?
Hello, my name is Vania. Sorry, I'm a little bit out, but if my video is on,
I see you.
The internet is slower.
Here on one side. Okay.
So, first of all, thank you so much for being with us and the very, very interesting presentation.
Thank you so much.
So I have like sort of a very long thought process follow-up question, which is in line of what you said earlier, that we grew up in a family that was not really with a religious background, and who said it in class, someone who was the only one in the family that wasn't baptized. And I guess that's very common, especially in my generation or in our generation. And so I guess my question is that this quote that I don't have a religious background is something that is very typical in Western culture, because our understanding of religion is one that is institutionalized. While in many more indigenous societies, nature itself is the religion, especially before Christians came and missionaries came. And even though today many indigenous communities that have been strongly influenced by missionaries still have this core connection to nature through which they often define their spirituality with the frame of being Christian around it. These like remainers of animism spirituality. So my question, I guess, is, do you see religious naturalism as some sort of reconciliation of the Western mindset, which clearly understands a scientific worldview, because that's the way we've been conditioned in our everyday life, with some deeper understanding of nature? Because, I mean, science, on one hand, can explain where do we come from, the Big Bang. Who are we? We are biological beings, but it can't really answer the question, what are we doing here? And what would be your answer to an indigenous perspective on religious naturalism, and an answer of religious naturalism to what are we doing here? Sorry, it was really long and comprehensive.
No, that's lovely, but I understand why you put the two together, but let me try to take them apart a little bit.
Okay. I'm going to mute my microphone now.
Okay. So I'm hardly an expert on indigenous cultures, but I have done a lot of reading about it, and a wonderful friend named John Grimm, who's amazing. One thing to understand about all of those indigenous traditions is they all have narratives, right? They all have stories about how the human began, and what the human's relationship is to the crow and to the coyote and to the trees, and how all of it happened. So they are religions in that sense of having a core story, interpreting it, responding to it spiritually through dancing and ceremonies and all of that, and for having these stories be organizing influences on how their tribe considers what's right and what's wrong, and what to kill, and whom to marry, and all the other things that are essential to human political life. And so what I think scientific inquiry does, and let's just stick with biology because most of the animistic traditions have to do with the biological world more than the Big Bang, I say, is that scientific inquiry has given us this incredibly not known and really counterintuitive understanding of what life is. As I think you noted, DNA, ribosomes, all that stuff would have never crossed someone's mind 500 years ago, and let alone 160,000 years ago, when we were first at least had skulls that looked like our skulls. And so the responses of the early humans and all humans to nature has always been one of how much information they have, including a lot of disinformation about how that tree has evil spirits that are going to kill you if you walk by it, etc. So science clears all that up, but for a lot of people who, I'll just use the term anti-science for a minute, feel like scientific understanding has destroyed nature in a way, that it's all about these molecules and everything, and gee, if only I were, you know, someone living in the bush in Africa and just thinking about nature the way humans used to think about it, I'd be much happier and feel more at home. Well, that's a hurdle to go. I'm obviously a molecular biologist, so for me, all of these understandings about proteins and everything flip me out. I mean, they flip me out as much as any lightning storm or any story about some crow who delivered people to safety or anything else. I mean, it's just amazing stuff. And so for me, it's not at all hard to develop awe and wonder and gratitude and reverence for all of these understandings. But it's not intuitive, and it's not, you know, and it's hard work to get it, and it's very easy for people, particularly people who want you to believe something else, to disparage it. And so these are our times. This is particularly in the United States, the whole anti-evolution thing is really still huge. Now, you had a second part to this, which I'm not sure I'm remembering. Do you have to get your mic to do it again?
I guess my second part, first of all, thank you for answering so comprehensively. I guess my second part would be how religious naturalism could answer the question, why are we here?
Oh, yeah, okay. I don't think
because it's based on science, which can explain.
No, science.
Yeah.
So first of all, let's get a few more terms straight. The science is a method. Okay, it's a way of asking questions, and there's social science, and there's all sorts of science. So when we talk about science loosely, what we're really talking about is our understandings that we glean from science. And so I'll use the term loosely as well, but let's make it clear that that's what it is. And so what this scientific inquiry has given us is this incredible picture of the last 14 billion years, and making sense out of that, and why are we here, and what's the meaning of life, is a search. Okay, it's a search that humans have always been undergoing, I would say, and have always been coming up with answers that come from traditions. And very often, more often than not, the traditions sort of punt the question. They say this isn't the real deal. The real deal is the afterlife. The real deal is being reincarnated in Asian traditions. So finding a meaning in this life is more, being good and getting to heaven, or meeting with Allah, or all of these other expectations, rather than offering a way to have the meaning of one's life be oriented here now as a critter on this planet. Each of us, I think, in the end, can answer that question only personally, or at least I hope it would come personally. So I'll answer it personally. For me, I am just gobsmacked that I have this life at all. I mean, what the hell? I mean, 400,000 eggs in my mother's ovary, millions of sperm, and I got it, right? And I grew up and I'm having this experience. That to me is so amazing and such a gift and such an honor. Do I wish that I could live forever and not die? No, actually, that seems kind of boring. The whole immediacy of life and its short term and its aging and development and everything is, to me, part of its excitement. So that's sort of what works for me. And the many books on our website on religious naturalists all have different meanings that they offer. But I think that's part of the fun of doing this, is that you don't have to say that you're going to find meaning after you die. you find meaning now.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't
Okay.
see you. That's
Hi. Thank you, Amalis. Thank you very much. You gave us a lot to think about. I was just thinking of your paper and what you said today. And I remember when you.
Excuse me, did Gabriel give you a paper to read? Because I didn't remember that he did.
Excerpts from the book.
Oh yes, an excerpt from.
You didn't give it to us. We just assigned it.
Okay. All right. Good to know.
Oh yes, sir. Yeah, we had to read some paper from you for today, and you wrote that believing and loving something supernatural is not for you. You wrote something like that, and when I read this, I started thinking about the word supernatural and about, I mean, supernatural that is kind of upon nature, beyond nature, and this dichotomy we still have between natural and supernatural. And you today talked about considering humanities and cultures as part of nature, and I started thinking, why can't we include also what we consider supernatural in what is natural? Of course, the word seems to say that either something is natural or it's supernatural. But why can't we be open to the idea that what we call supernatural is just something natural that we are not able to understand because of the limitedness of our human nature and of our human brain? Also, in your writings, you write about the universe. Oh, sorry.
Can we do that one first? Because when we have two questions, and I forget what the second one is.
Yeah, but this is actually part of this one. It's just a mini extension of this one. Also, you talked about the universe, but the idea of nature still seems quite geocentric, while not including in what is supernatural either things that we are just not able to understand, or things that maybe somehow are just beyond the Earth, but somehow can be natural somewhere else in the universe.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So once again, a definition. So how do we define nature? So again, blah blah blah. Lots of people have done this. For me, nature is all that has yet been understood about the past and the present of our universe. Now, there are many, many things that science doesn't understand. I mean, so like most of the only 5 to 7% of the universe is made out of matter. Okay, so we know a lot about matter, but the rest of it is dark energy and dark matter and all of these things that we know have to exist from considerations of gravity, basically, but we don't know what they are, we don't know what they do, we don't know how they work. So we don't even have to go into something like meaning or something like that. There are a lot of things about the universe itself that we don't understand. Is dark matter part of nature? I would say, yeah, probably, because it seems to be necessary to hold the universe together. But the minute you get to the very large, to the universe, not to mention, are there other universes, blah, 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 there's lots of mystery, as that quote that I lifted up said. There are lots of things we don't understand. Of course, 1,000 years ago, we didn't understand why a child looked like his or her parent. And now we have some pretty good ideas about that. So the fact that we don't understand something doesn't mean that it's not understandable. But there's still plenty of mystery. There's plenty of mystery at the other end, too, with quantum physics and the particles that make up the nucleus and all of that. There's lots of stuff that are total head scratchers and people don't yet understand them. So science hasn't given us a picture that gives us everything. So do you call that which science doesn't understand yet, or do you call that supernatural, or do you call that something that science doesn't understand yet? Usually, when people are talking about supernatural, they're trying to talk about something that has a role to play in how nature works. So it's usually about something that has to do, as in Phil Hefner's thing, a God who creates, or in indigenous tribes, ancestors who have influence over the present day, dead ancestors who are able to influence people's lives, or in Asian traditions, the whole concept of karma and coming back in accordance with one's karma in a previous life. These are all things that have an influence on nature, have an influence on the world. And those, by definition, to me, are beliefs, okay? And I'm not here, I think a religious naturalist would never be here to say, you have to believe in this and not in that. We just say, there's so much to think about in terms of what we understand about nature that we don't really have time for, I won't say bothering ourselves, but for trying to get our heads wrapped around something that we could posit, but what is its role in nature? How does it act on the world? How does it work? I mean, that's just not all that interesting. Does that make any sense? I'm not saying it's not out there. I'm just saying that in this particular line of exploration, there's lots to think about without positing something that is in our minds but has not had any evidence to support its existence.
Thank you for the clarification.
Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. There is Peter now, I think. Oh, that was okay.
Hi.
Hi.
I have two questions, and one would be an extension of what Alice just talked about in a way. So the first one is, I was just wondering, when religions are so new compared to the evolution of life, especially in this galaxy or this planet, and the early forms of life were working in harmony with nature, then what suddenly happened? In the sense that we were supposed to be evolving from our ancestors in a better way, and then the cultures and traditions we have in the past were all about harmony with nature, and then we suddenly shifted our gears and we started working towards the doom of it. And the second would be, if religious naturalism, I mean, it's a question, in fact, is religious naturalism a way to connect back to the God in terms of a supernatural spirit being present there, or it is a way to convey to the common population of how they should act? That's it.
Okay. Well, how they should act, I hope, has become clear that I'm not suggesting religious naturalist would have the answers in terms of legislation. But I think if there were a lot of people who were religious naturalistically inclined, were actually able to get together. I mean, I open up the sacred depths of nature with the fantasy that if everybody on the planet could adopt this kind of orientation, at least in terms of planetary considerations, that we'd have a lot easier time sitting around at the table and trying to figure out what to do about the many problems that are anthropogenic, like climate change, nuclear weapons, you name it. While it's true that at all times since life began, there has been this interaction with nature that has led to the evolution of organisms into new forms that exist in new niches and so on, the whole evolutionary story. I will call you on your term of, you use the adjective better, and I don't think it's the case that organisms have gotten better, or at least I think that that can be a dangerous avenue to anthropocentricity or animal centricity or something. You know, organisms are evolving to fit into the niches that they find themselves in, and often they create new niches in the process, and that's just the way it is on this planet, and presumably be the way it is on all other planets. So what got messed up, of course, is that once we figured out how to control things in our environment, and we're not the only organisms that do that. We could say that a beaver builds a dam and lives in the dam and has controlled the environment. But we obviously have taken that to, I would say, ridiculous portions, and have gotten ourselves into a lot of trouble in the process, and that something needs to happen to turn us around and get back to a more sustainable way of sharing the planet with other creatures and each other.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just say one thing. I have to punch anything? Okay. Hi, hi. It's Peter Brown. I'm the professor in the course, and you can see that I'm not doing much, right? But I've really enjoyed this. I've read your works in the past, and very much appreciated it. I'm a Quaker myself, and I spend fortunate enough to spend quite a bit of time outside in the woods, places like that, and my experience of that sort of setting is that it's sacred, and that, you know, I'm sort of his Quaker phrase would be bathed in the light from time to time when I'm there, and so it's very, very warming and very grateful for your message of how we should think about ourselves as beings on this planet. So just thank you so much.
Thank you. That was lovely.
Oh, the Tim, go ahead. Yeah. 5 minutes.
It's a little stretched. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Hi, my name's Tim. I really enjoyed reading the chapters that we were assigned of your book, Sacred Depths of Nature. Found it very sort of enlightening. And one idea in it that struck me is you discuss your own struggle with nihilism and the fact that that's something you had to escape from. And I think, like, the scientific narrative that you discuss, it can go one of two ways. That it can sort of lead to this position of awe of the natural world, and people like Carl Sagan and Richard Feynman speak about that very eloquently. But the other way it can lead is to the idea of nihilism, or, you know, the position of nihilism. I was wondering, is there a clear reason to you why you find yourself going in one direction, to religious naturalism rather than nihilism? I mean, obviously nihilism, the effect on the individual is not pleasant or productive, but is it just a matter of attitude? Is it a leap of faith, or do you find a convincing reason that it is the better choice?
Okay, well, I'm going to go there. So Loyal Rue, in one of his books, they're all mixed up in my mind, but one of them, he starts out, I think it's Everybody's Story. He starts out by saying, okay, let's get this on the table. I actually think nihilism is true, but it's an abhorrent truth, and I refuse to believe it. And I don't know whether that resonates with any of you, but that's where I am. I mean, it's true in the sense that there's absolutely ridiculous to, in fact, believe, unless you believe that there is a creator who created all of this and has it all out for us, that nature is anything except, as people say, nature just is. Nature is doing her, if we give her a gender, her thing, but is not interested in us. And Dawkins and everybody else has said the same thing. And I have no way to argue against that nihilistic perspective, but I find it abhorrent. I refuse to live my life that way. If that were really my life, I might as well commit suicide and get it over with. Instead, I see that the planet is gorgeous, bathed in light, as your professor just said, and tremendously exciting and creative and everything else. And so whether it has any ultimate meaning, which is what nihilism suggests, the universe doesn't suggest. There is so much proximate meaning in terms of one's life and one's experiences that I just think it's not worth getting oneself into a mess about it.
Thank you.
Hi, I do have a question that kind of ties in with some of the things others have been saying. A passage that you had in the Sacred Depths of Nature about mystery. So the mystery of why there is anything at all rather than nothing, the mystery of what the laws of physics come from, the mystery of why the universe seems so strange, that these are things that kind of give you hope in a sense, that they fill you up, the idea of of focusing on the mystery of it, which I thought was very interesting. And you also spoke about how it used to be that there were misunderstandings or people didn't understand what caused lightning or thunder, and so they came up with perhaps supernatural explanations for lightning or thunder, but now we know what actually causes them. But what I find interesting is that in certain religious circles now, there is made the claim that these mysteries that you point to can never be answered by science. And I was wondering what your position is on that. For example, why there is anything at all, or where the rules of physics come from, these mysteries. Can science ever approach them, or are they completely outside the realm of science?
I don't think they're outside the realm. I think if we get through the present bottleneck we have to get through so that we don't blow ourselves up or something, and we keep making inquiries, then it may be in ways that we can't even imagine right now that it is going to be possible to find out whether there are other universes, and if so, how they operate, and if so, better understand why ours operates given the laws of the particles and so on that we've discovered. So when you're a scientist, you never say there's no answer to that question, because that sounds arrogant. It sounds like you know that there's no answer, and you don't. But I'm also perfectly happy to be in a situation right now in a world where there's so much that has come to be understood that one can ponder and rejoice in, and that it hasn't all been figured out yet, and that I can, as I said in the book, articulate this covenant with mystery and be perfectly happy to exist where some things don't yet have answers, and maybe will never have answers. And if they have answers, if answers come up, then by definition, it's going to be the scientific process that's going to come up with them. It's not going to be human intuition. It's going to be, oh, here's some data. Let's see whether this works. Let's see whether this idea that there's another universe out there that Professor Jones has just posited whether she's right or not, and let's get our own instruments and see if this other universe is there. That's science. That's doing science, and that's how we figure stuff out.
Yes, I definitely agree, and I always like the idea that scientists should never be afraid of saying "I don't know." That is the very basic.
Say it every day. Believe me. Yeah, I mean, even when in the stuff that you're studying in the lab that you're supposedly the world expert, there's all sorts of stuff that you don't know about the process or the critter, whatever that you're studying. So people get very pants in a wedge about how scientists are so arrogant and so know-it-all and everything, and that's just baloney. If you are, you're laughed out of the room.
All right. Well, we've kept you here until 4. So,
oh, okay. That might cut off.
Unless there are any pressing questions, or I guess we can let you go.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Amazing presentation. Thank you.
It's been a wonderful conversation, and thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah,